In this video, I'm going to show how to detect when a new item is typed in an autocomplete text view in Android when that item does not exist in the collection that is feeding that autocomplete text view. Wow, I know that's a lot to say, so let me demonstrate it. Here we have an Austrian pine, and you notice if I start typing something else like Easter, it will autocomplete with a series of words that match what I've typed. The trick is that if I make up my own plant, let's say Eastern Checkers Pine, how do I know that that doesn't exist in the list, and how can I take action based on that? So that's what we're going to look at in this video, and this is actually the first part of a two-part series. First, we're going to detect that something has been typed in that autocomplete that doesn't exist. After that, in the next video, I'm going to show how to use a custom dialog with a custom layout to then prompt the user to create a new entry that we can then save in something like a room database that will feed this autocomplete. So a little bit of work, which is why I'm splitting it into two different videos. Let's focus on the autocomplete detection right now, and here are the steps we're going to follow. First of all, a couple things that we've already done. Add the autocomplete text view to the layout, and we know that we already have that because I demonstrated that just a moment ago. And then populate the autocomplete with data. And in this case, I'm populating this autocomplete with data that I'm getting from a RESTful JSON service, and then I'm also saving it into a local room database. So those are a couple of things I've done in previous videos. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the autocomplete text view, which I'm abbreviating here, ACTV, and we're going to use a combination of listener events to determine if the user has selected something that already exists, or if the user has typed something new that does not exist. So we're going to focus on the OnItemClickListener, the OnItemSelectedListener, and then the OnFocusChangeListener. The reason being, if you look at an autocomplete text view, if I type Eastern, how do I select this Eastern redbud in this list here based on the autocomplete? Well, I can click it just like so. Or if I type Eastern again, I could simply arrow down and I could pick it this way. So those two selection events will be captured by the OnItemClickListener in case I click it from the list, or the OnItemSelectedListener in case I cursor down and pick it like so. If I type a new item, notice that I'm simply tabbing off of the field or moving off of the field one way or another, not by clicking on that field and not by selecting an item on that field, but by losing the focus on that field and going to a different field. So that's where the OnFocusChangeListener comes in, and that's why we need to use each of these listeners to determine if something has been entered into that autocomplete text view that does not exist. So let's jump right in. Since we already have this autocomplete text view, I've already set up the observable that provides the data for the autocomplete, and I've also already set up the OnItemClickListener, but you see it's very straightforward. We're simply getting the item that the user has picked out of that autocomplete, and we're saving it into a variable called selectedPlant. Now, this variable is going to be very important, so we're going to need to use it in multiple listeners. So I'm going to promote it from being a local variable to being an attribute. First of all, let's split, and that will let us take this and move it up to the attribute level, and we can simply say, start it off as a new plant. Plant's one of our DTOs that represents a scientific definition of a plant. It requires a few values for genus, species, and cultivar. So I'm just going to leave those as blank strings right now because this will likely get replaced fairly soon, but nonetheless, that'll give it something to compare it to. Finally, net, you see the OnItemClickListener is simply getting the item that the user selected from this view, and it's also doing a little bit of magic with a plant ID. Not so worried about that at the moment. So that's good for the OnItemClickListener. Now let's make the OnItemSelectedListener, which is going to be very similar to the OnItemClickListener. Remember, the click happens if we tap on something from that autocomplete, where the select happens if we're on a computer and we arrow up or down and then press enter. So two ways of doing a similar thing. Now the OnItemClickListener we were able to do pretty quickly because we're essentially implementing an interface that has only one function in it. So it uses a lambda expression here to just give us the body of that function. The OnItemSelectedListener is a little bit different because instead of overriding one function, we're overriding two functions. So we can't do that same type of lambda. So a little different syntax here. First of all, you note that we need to make kind of like an inline inner class here. We're saying we're making a class that's going to implement this OnItemSelectedListener interface. And we're saving it to an object. Now you notice that object gets a red line right away, which you might think, oh my gosh, I did it wrong. But hang tight just a moment. Let's put our cursor over the object and Alt-Enter, and that will give us a hint. It says implement members. And if you take a look, it's the two functions that we want to override. So we go ahead and override those. Now OnItemSelected, this is going to be very similar to OnItemClick. As a matter of fact, we can just copy the same logic, or if you prefer to be a little less redundant, we could even push that into a different function that we call from both OnItemClick and also OnItemSelected. Now, if nothing is selected, on nothing selected, we need to go back and do something similar to how we initialized this variable. Remember how we just set it to essentially an empty plant. So we're saying, okay, nothing selected here, selected plant equals plant with nothing in it. You could also maybe do some null tricks here if you wanted, depending on how you want to deal with nullness, but empty plant will work for me. Additionally, since we're using multiple listeners here, it's going to be a little challenging to keep them apart. So I've added a bit of kdoc above each of the items and say, hey, we have essentially selected something that already exists, which now takes us to the final step, which is where we realize something was typed in that does not exist. For this, we need a OnFocusChangeListener, and we take two parameters, view and hasFocus. We just need a bit of logic here. If it is a new plant that someone has entered in our case, or in other words, a new item, all we're going to have is the string that the user entered. So let's start by grabbing the string that currently is in that autocomplete, and let's save that into a variable called enteredPlant. Now with that, we can do a bit of a comparison. A bit of a complicated if test, so let's look at it one step at a time. First of all, selected plant. Remember that is that attribute that we're storing in the item click or the item selected. And first I'm comparing it to not null. Might even be better if I just compare that to the plant with the 3 empties. But either way, it depends on how you decide to handle nulls. I'll go ahead and leave that in there, even though it's not likely it will ever be null. I'll go ahead and leave that in there. I'll leave that up to you how you wish to do that comparison. Next, entered plant. We want to make sure that is not empty. Now remember what entered plant is. That's the text that the user has just entered into the autocomplete. So the first 2 comparisons here are just making sure we're dealing with valid data for which we can do a comparison, which is a prerequisite to the final test, which is the most important test. Look at this final test, and again, a little tricky, so let's decompose it one at a time. Entered plant is a string, it's text. We're doing an equals comparison to selected plant and its text. We get that text from the toString function on selected plant. Now, why are we comparing text to text when we know that selected plant is actually a plant object? Well, when we're rendering the plants in the autocomplete, it is going to call the toString function on each plant object. So this is actually a like-for-like comparison because we're comparing what the user will see or the user will type in that autocomplete. And right now we're asking, are these two equal? But pay close attention to the exclamation. The exclamation says, are they not equal? Well, if the user has selected a valid item, it's going to be populated in the selected plant from our 2 listeners up above. But if the user has not picked a valid item that already exists, well, then it's just going to be in this entered plant, but that's not going to be equal to whatever the selected plant is. Now, I know that's a little hard to describe, so forgive me if I'm tripping over words a little bit, but essentially we're saying, is the text in that autocomplete right now equal to a valid item that's already in that autocomplete? And we're negating that by saying, if they're not equal, then we have a new plant. So let me go ahead and say here, we have a new plant. Now for me it's a plant. You might be putting something else in your autocomplete, maybe a car, maybe a person. So where I'm saying plant, just whatever your noun class is, whatever your data class is, whatever the thing is you're storing in that autocomplete. At this point, we want to ask the user to create a new entry. I'm going to handle that in a separate video where we look at dialog fragments, but we can still kind of simulate things with a toast. So for the moment, until we have that dialog fragment, I'll just show a toast. Looks like I have just a couple other things I need to take care of. One of them is we need to do a null check on this parent. Probably a good idea to wrap a bit of null checking around that, but nonetheless, with this, we should be in good shape. I now have it running in the debugger. I don't have any breakpoints just yet. Let's just watch the flow. I change this to Eastern Redbud and look to see if a toast comes up. No toast comes up, so it recognizes that plant. I lose focus, and again, it recognizes that plant. Now we'll change it to, say, Eastern Hemlock. That's fine. But this time I'll use my arrow and enter and tab away. Once again, you notice no toast comes up. Let's try one more time and say Eastern Checkers Pine. I tab away, and if you look right here, enter a new plant. This time we had the toast. So with that, let's go ahead and reset it back to Austrian Pine. And I'm going to set some breakpoints so that we can watch it happen step by step. Okay, we start with Eastern Redbud, and I'm going to click. If you notice when I click this time, I press F8, and what's in selected plant? Selected plant is Eastern Redbud, and I choose F9. I'll tab away so we lose focus. And notice that the OnFocusChangeListener fires, but let's watch closely here. Selected plant is Eastern Redbud. Entered plant, also Eastern Redbud. So what is this going to evaluate to? Well, let's highlight it, and then let's evaluate expression. Evaluate. And we'll see that this comes to false, but again, that's kind of a tricky comparison because actually entered plant does equal selected plant. We're just using that exclamation to set the negation operator. So because that evaluates to false, and all of these conditions are appended together with the double ampersand or the and, it's going to completely skip that toast and move on to the next step. Now let's try again, but this time we will create our own plant. The Eastern Checkers Pine. And I tab away, and note what happens when I tab away. We go back to our OnFocusChangeListener. I press F8. Selected plant is what? Eastern Redbud. Entered plant is what? Eastern Checkers Pine. Once again, it's all going to come down to this last part. So let's evaluate. And we see that this now evaluates to true. So each of these comparisons evaluates to true. They're all put together with a double ampersand, so the entire unit evaluates to true, and guess what? It's going to show our toast. And sure enough, yep, there's our toast. So in this video, we've seen how to detect a new item typed into an autocomplete that is not in the adapter. And that will set us up well for our next video where we create a dialog with a custom layout. And what we're going to do is if a new item is entered, we're going to put up a dialog box here and we're going to ask the user for a bit more information, and then we're going to create a new item, and with that item, we could put it into our data store that is feeding this autocomplete. So our data store is essentially growing over time. I hope this video was helpful, and as always, I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.